Can you imagine how complicated it is in this crazy world to find a decent job? If you had a bit of experience, you'd know how valuable even a simple job offer can sometimes be. Let me tell you how I ended up in the worst job of my life. This story begins in 2009, in the midst of a recession that left many people unemployed and in many cases even drove them onto the streets. I was working in a call center. Of course, it wasn't the best job in the world, but it allowed me to pay my bills and keep a roof over my head, which was already something to be grateful for. But as the recession worsened, I suddenly lost my job. The situation was anything but easy, faced with a pile of unpaid bills and an uncertain future. At that time, internet access wasn't as widespread as it is today, so my only options were to look for job ads in the newspapers or ask friends if they knew of any opportunities. After a month in which I practically ate nothing but instant noodles and water, I came across an ad that caught my attention. They were looking for cleaning staff for a boarding school. I had never cleaned anything other than my own room, let alone worked in a boarding school, but the pay was tempting. And more importantly, I needed a job desperately. The only problem was that the job was in another federal state, which meant I'd have to leave my life behind and move. Fortunately, I had no family or a house of my own, so I decided to take a chance. I finally called the number in the ad, and to my surprise, I was scheduled for a phone interview a few days later. After the conversation, they told me I got the job. For the first time, I felt relieved. I'd never been hired so quickly. A few days later, I received a plane ticket. They wanted me to arrive as soon as possible. Without much thought, I sold everything I couldn't take with me and packed my things for my new adventure. When I arrived at the boarding school, a car took me to a strange isolated complex on a hill, where I'd be living in one of the apartments of a small building I shared with someone I didn't know. I soon met some of the staff, all of whom seemed a bit distant, as if they didn't want me there. But I didn't think much of it. After all, I didn't plan to interact with them regularly. During the interview, they made it clear that my job would be to clean the school after the students had left, starting at 5 p.m. Perfect, I thought. The school was very close to where I lived, so that was no problem. On my first day, I met my fellow cleaners, Marcella, an older woman who swept the floors, and Kevin, a middle-aged man who took care of the bathrooms. I was a bit surprised that only 3 of us were responsible for cleaning an entire school because it was a big building. My job was to sweep and clean the classrooms that had been in use and also make sure the principal's office and the teacher's lounge were tidy and in good condition. When I asked Marcella why there wasn't more staff, her answer was a bit strange, though I didn't catch the eerie meaning at the time. "No one stays here for long," she said in a somewhat grim tone. As for Kevin, he apparently didn't like to speak. In the first few weeks, I just went about my work and explored what I could. The school had a strange atmosphere, and sometimes I felt that the hallways were devoid of life. Yet there was something in the air that made me uneasy, and I couldn't shake the feeling. My experiences with my colleagues were sparse, and most of my interactions revolved around the work itself, which felt increasingly monotonous and lonely. One day, while I was cleaning a classroom, I got a shiver down my spine, that strange feeling of being watched, but there was no one else in the room. I tried not to take it too seriously and kept working. Suddenly, though, I heard a murmuring, like a soft but distinct whisper. I looked around, wondering if my nerves were getting the best of me or if one of my co-workers was nearby. But there was no one there. Day after day, I continued my work, and eventually those whispering sounds returned. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But one day, while I was arranging some chairs, I heard the murmuring again, and this time it sounded less like a whisper and more like a whimper, as if someone was in pain and complaining. It made my blood run cold, but I decided to ignore it and get on with my work, convinced I was just tired and stressed. Over time, I felt more and more oppressed by the atmosphere of the place. One night, while I was trying to clean a classroom that always seemed dark, I saw a shadow move from the corner of my eye. But when I turned around, there was no one there, just the heavy air and silence. I began asking Marcella, who was practically the only person I spoke to occasionally, about the history of the boarding school. But she cut the conversation short with a nervous look and went on with her tasks. My instincts told me something was wrong, that there was a reason why they didn't or couldn't tell me anything. Each day I asked myself whether I'd made the wrong decision taking this job. I felt like I was trapped in a place I didn't want to be, surrounded by a secret I couldn't unravel and the shadows of a past that seemed to be devouring me. But for the moment I had no choice but to stay. I needed the job. Eventually, after many inquiries, Marcella warned me never to go to the 3rd floor or any of the upper floors. "For your safety," she said seriously. It sounded odd, but in truth I'd never felt such relief because it made my job much easier. Fewer parts of the building I had to clean. That evening I put my headphones on, turned the volume to some jazz and went on with my work. Time flew by and I didn't even notice how much I'd already done. When I got back to my apartment, my roommate who taught science was busy grading papers, so I quickly cooked something and ended my day. The days went on and they all felt the same. The children at the school seemed well behaved, but I preferred to keep my distance. I only noticed that the atmosphere was strange, as if everyone was lost in their own thoughts and didn't talk much with each other, like a heavy shadow hanging over the school. I tried several times to speak with the staff, but it was always unsuccessful, so I decided just to focus on my work. When I finally received my first paycheck, I felt like I was on cloud 9, finally seeing the fruits of all those lonely, quiet nights. But the next day, while I was cleaning a classroom on the 2nd floor near the staircase that led to the forbidden floors, I heard something unusual. The music in my headphones suddenly stopped and I thought I heard laughter. It was only 6 p.m., so I thought maybe a child was outside making noise. Out of curiosity, I peeked into the hallway and heard the laughter again, this time from above. I knew Marcella had warned me not to go upstairs, but I couldn't resist my curiosity and decided to find out what was going on. As I went up the stairs, a strange weight fell over me, as if someone was sitting on my shoulders. But I'm a brave guy, so I ignored it and kept going. The laughter got closer and now it seemed like the voice was right next to me. I looked down the hallway to my left, which was empty, and then to my right, where there was a long dark corridor, but nobody was there. The giggling continued, so I walked on, trying to see who was at the end of the hallway. Then I saw something. There was a boy about 7 years old with pale skin, bright blue eyes, and very blonde curly hair. This little boy smiled at me in such a sweet and innocent way. I smiled back and was just about to ask him what he was doing there when I suddenly heard more giggling behind me. I turned around and couldn't believe my eyes. The same boy was standing behind me. How had he gotten there so fast, I wondered. But before I could react, the boy I'd seen before was again at the end of the hallway, smiling in such a creepy way that it made my blood run cold. I had no time to wonder what was happening when suddenly his head sprang off his shoulders and a fountain of blood splattered all over me. I froze, unable to scream, run, or move. Then I felt a tap on my shoulder, and when I turned around I saw the same headless boy holding a bloody knife. That was the last thing I remember before everything went dark and my body fell to the floor. I woke up with a light shining into my eyes. As my vision adjusted, I saw the principal, my roommate, and a doctor all looking at me with concern. "What happened? Why am I in the hospital?" I asked, still confused. The principal explained that Kevin, the other cleaner, had found me unconscious on the 3rd floor. "What were you doing up there?" the principal asked. "You were told you're not supposed to go to the upper floors," he scolded me. So I told them everything that happened, though my head ached and I felt stitches on my forehead. "You hit your head when you fell," the doctor explained. "We had to stitch you up, but in a week you'll be fine." "Maybe that explains what you think you hallucinated," the doctor said with a forced smile. I was grateful for their help, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was off. That same afternoon I was discharged, but on the way home I asked the principal what was really going on at the boarding school because I was sure I hadn't been hallucinating. His expression changed abruptly after I asked. After a deep sigh, he told me a story that made my blood freeze. 3 years earlier there had been a terrible incident at the facility. One morning while Kevin was cleaning the bathrooms on the 3rd floor, he found something at the end of the hallway. It was the head of a little boy, one of the students. "That was the only time I heard Kevin scream," said the principal. Kevin followed the blood trail from the head and found the rest of the body farther down the hallway. It was a scandal. The police could never catch the perpetrator. They said it was a hate crime, that maybe a jealous child had done it, but they also accused staff and a serial killer they never found. In the end, the case was closed and no one was ever held accountable for the murder of that innocent child. I felt cold hearing this, but the principal continued. There are rumors that many children and several staff members have seen the headless boy on the 3rd floor. That's why we had to close those floors and build a new entrance for the boys' dormitories. The school owners paid the boys' parents a large sum and used some connections so that it never went public. That's why we've been very cautious about the matter, and I would appreciate it if you were careful. That evening I took my pay, packed my things, and decided to return to my city. I was unemployed again, but that didn't matter because I felt much safer far away from that place. Whenever I think about what happened, I know I should never have gone to that boarding school. My instincts had warned me from the start that something wasn't right. It took me a while to recover from the psychological effects of the experience. I remember exactly every detail. When Mr. Norris asked all the students in class to bring something old or historical from home, I knew right away what I'd present. My grandmother had left me a record player, a huge thing made of brass and wood, along with a box full of vinyl records. When it came to retro items, that was definitely number one. I thought it would be a hit, but that was before Alan showed up with that terrible box and I experienced the worst day of my life. No one believes me when I tell the truth, and honestly I can't blame them. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't been there. But I know it happened. Alan showed up that day, proud, with the relic in our class. "Is that Latin?" Mr. Norris asked as he unpacked the box. Alan smiled and shrugged. "I'm not sure, but I think it's been in my family forever. I found it in the attic." Mr. Norris turned the box in his hands, trying to figure out what it could be. It was a little smaller than a shoebox, made of dark mahogany, with letters or symbols carved into it. The container gleamed as if it had just been polished. Honestly, I found it fascinating. Even though most of the class had no interest in antiques, who could blame them? The sun was shining outside and we were close to summer vacation, since most of us were seniors. This was our last break before university. Who would want to pay attention to an old wooden box? Mr. Norris lifted the box to eye level. "Well, I can read Latin," he said. "And I think this artifact Alan brought is very old." Alan smiled again, and I could see he was pleased to get the teacher's attention. He wasn't the type who had many friends. As far as I knew, Alan usually spent most of his time in the back row with his hoodie on, lost in his own world with his headphones. But back to the box, something about it bothered me. It had a sinister vibe that made me uneasy. The wooden box had a small latch that had to be twisted to open it. Mr. Norris turned it and put the box back down without opening it. "Some of the markings are faded," the teacher said, "but I think I can make out the meaning from context. It basically says there's an invisible man trapped in the box and it warns never to release him unless you're among enemies." "Hey guys, are we enemies?" the teacher joked. "Depends if you cancel tomorrow's test," I replied in the same tone. My answer made the teacher and the class laugh. But after the laughter died down, Mr. Norris cleared his throat and slowly began reading in a language I didn't understand, presumably Latin. He kept holding the box, turning it carefully, and then the lid opened on its own. "Yes, you heard that right. It opened on its own." Alan frowned. "What the hell?" the teacher exclaimed. And at that moment dark shapes began to emerge from the box. At first they looked like black fingers, but then these shadows gradually took shape like a flow of thick motor oil. This mass splattered onto the floor and split into 20 or 30 dark creatures, each about 3 feet tall. They reminded me of little devils or goblins, but they had no recognizable features, just dark silhouettes. Some kids in my class screamed, but I remained rooted to my seat watching these creatures. I wondered if it was some kind of trick or a projector in the box projecting holograms. But suddenly one of these black things jumped on Alan, wrapping its long limbs like tentacles around his torso. The monster got so close to Alan that it stuck what looked like fingers into his mouth, opening it wider and wider until I heard his jaw crack. Alan tried to scream, but the creature crawled inside his mouth, and all you could hear was a wet gargle. After a moment, Alan closed his mouth again and looked at us calmly. But he was no longer the same person. We were all frozen with shock, even Mr. Norris. Nobody noticed that another one of the creatures was climbing up the wall behind the teacher until it was too late. The thing jumped onto his back and forced itself into his mouth as well. Those scenes broke our paralysis, and suddenly chaos erupted. Chairs and desks flew as we ran out of the classroom in a panic. Screams and crying filled the corridors as we bumped into each other, fell over and tried to escape the monsters that were now everywhere. I managed to get out of the room and fought my way through the crowd of terrified students. The last thing I heard was Mr. Norris shouting into the phone, "Attention, potential threat." He said the school had to go on lockdown. My eyes widened at those words. If they locked the school, we'd be trapped inside with the monsters in the box. Suddenly someone pulled the fire alarm, and the students poured into the corridors again. "Back to your classrooms," I shouted as I pushed against the crowd. But then the creatures spread throughout the corridor, and all hell broke loose. The lights went out completely, and the red emergency lamps switched on. Everywhere you looked there were screams and monsters pouncing on my classmates, forcing their mouths open. In the midst of this madness, I managed to slip into the janitor's closet and lock myself in. Someone started banging on the door, but I just curled up and covered my ears to block out the shrieking. Eventually the noise died down, probably just minutes after I'd entered the closet, but it felt like an eternity. I counted to 300, then slowly opened the door. The hallway was now empty. I walked a few steps out and saw a shadow at the end of the corridor. It was still dark and the only light was the red glow of the emergency lamps. Then I realized something was moving toward me. I considered going back into the closet, but my classroom was now closer, and I hoped the monsters wouldn't return to where it all started. So I ran as quietly as possible to the classroom, sneaked in, and locked the door with a very satisfying click. I breathed deeply. The classroom was dark, and Alan's wooden box lay open and empty on the floor. The room kept getting colder the closer I got to the box. How could so many creatures have come out of such a small container? Before I could examine it further, I heard a dreadful scratching at the door. The scratching quickly turned to banging. I was trapped. Frantic, I looked for a way out, but there was none, not even a window. My eyes fixed on the box, which started to vibrate, almost as though it were humming. Then I had a plan. While the pounding on the door grew louder, I dashed toward the box, but with every step it felt like something was holding me back, like a gale blowing against me. My legs felt heavy, like I was running through mud. It was as if the box was fighting me off. Still, I finally reached it. Just as I was about to close it, I heard an ear-splitting screech from the corridor, so loud I covered my ears, afraid my eardrums would burst. I grew dizzy, and before I realized it, I lost consciousness. When I came to, the school's lights were back on. 2 paramedics knelt beside me, checking my vitals. They lifted me onto a stretcher despite my protests that I could walk, and took me to the hospital. I stayed there for the next 2 days. After that I was discharged and returned to school a week later. On my first day back I saw my classmates, and they all seemed totally normal, talking and joking like nothing had happened. Mr. Norris was also teaching as if nothing was wrong. According to the school administration, the whole incident was due to a gas leak that caused some students to suffer severe poisoning, which in certain cases, mine included, led to alleged hallucinations. I asked some classmates if they remembered the incident with the box and the monsters, and most of them looked at me oddly, insisting they had no memory of anything like that. Nobody seemed to remember the box or the monsters. I even spoke to Mr. Norris and he also denied that anything had happened. He claimed he was never able to open the box because several students suddenly became ill, and that I in particular had started screaming and running through the hall, supposedly yelling about monsters in a box, and then locked myself in the janitor's closet, where I was later found unconscious. I stared at the teacher with wide eyes, and when he saw how confused I was, he put a hand on my shoulder and assured me I didn't need to worry. I wasn't the only one who reacted that way, he said. But I don't believe it was a hallucination from the gas leak. Today I'm convinced it really happened. I don't know what happened afterward, or why I'm the only one who remembers, but I'm sure it was real, that those monsters somehow managed to erase everyone else's memory. I'm Jason, a college freshman, but I want to tell you about an experience I had in 5th grade, one I've never forgotten, and want to share with you now. I remember I was quite a mischievous kid, constantly playing pranks on my classmates, and sometimes even the teachers. Everyone was fed up with my antics, and it was not unusual for me to end up in the principal's office almost daily because of my classmates' complaints. The principal had had enough of me, so he gave me one last warning, and called my parents telling them I'd be kicked out if I didn't change. Honestly, I didn't care much about that. I kept on with my pranks until one day I got the idea to prank a classmate who was very studious and the teacher's favorite. I put on a ghost mask, and when he saw me he was so terrified that he fainted and ended up in the hospital. Guess what? That landed me right back in the principal's office. This time he was furious and gave me a huge lecture about my behavior. He called my parents again, and when they came in and heard what happened, they were so mad that they decided to send me to boarding school, something they'd threatened many times, but I'd never believed they'd actually do. I protested, but in the end I had no choice. I had to go. When I arrived, I immediately noticed that this boarding school had extremely strict rules with severe consequences for those who didn't follow them. At that time, I didn't realize how severe those consequences could be. This school was well known for reforming difficult students. Honestly, I wasn't happy at all, but no one cared what I thought. My parents left me there without listening, and I felt very sad and alone, as if they just wanted to be rid of me. I couldn't hold back my tears. In my room, the supervisor told me to hurry because I had to get to class. I was still crying, but I had to obey. While I was getting ready, I suddenly heard strange noises, like someone whispering my name quietly and slowly. My heart stopped for a moment. I stopped crying and felt the urge to run straight to class. In class, I introduced myself and tried to focus, but the noises still echoed in my head. At the end of class, everyone went to the cafeteria for dinner, but I had no appetite, so I stayed behind, lost in thought about my parents. I started crying again. Suddenly I heard the same strange noises again in my room. Of course I was petrified. I jumped up to run away, but I tripped, and at that moment I felt a presence drawing closer. Fear paralyzed me. Then everything went black. I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was lying on a bed, surrounded by boys and security guards asking what had happened. But I was so scared I couldn't speak. I couldn't tell them what I'd experienced. They would have thought I was crazy, or worse, that I was making excuses not to stay. Then the principal came and sent everyone to bed. The next day my parents called. We spoke on the phone, and they asked me how the school was. I quietly said everything was fine, but they noticed immediately that something was wrong. You know how parents are, so I told them about the strange noises that terrified me. I never thought a boarding school could be so scary. Each day I felt more consumed by loneliness and fear. I knew my pranks had led my family not to trust me anymore, and I couldn't really blame them. When I asked my father to let me come home because of all this, he assumed I was just making excuses to leave. I tried to convince them I was serious, but they hung up. That made me sad and depressed, but honestly I probably deserved it. Afterward, I was sitting in class trying to concentrate when we heard an announcement from the principal that shocked us all. He said the school had to close because a psychopath had attacked the facility. We all stood there, frozen, eyes wide, while the principal informed us that the police were already on their way, and that we should find safety. After these words, Master Harry lost it. He ran off to lock doors and windows and told us to hide under our desks. We followed his instructions, but my heart was racing. While trying to stay calm, the lights began flickering, and thunder rumbled outside. The kids panicked. Some cried, others even prayed. But in the midst of the chaos I heard that voice again, the one that had been following me. I went to the teacher and asked if he heard anything. "I don't hear anything, Jason. Go back to your seat," he said. But I knew what I'd heard, clear and frightening. I decided to find out where it was coming from. I opened the door, which stuck a bit, but I managed to get out and ran down the corridor. The voice came from a hallway at the end. As I ran, I felt like I was in a strange place, as though the hallway looked the same no matter where I turned, like I was trapped in a box. It was really weird and scary. I felt disoriented and lost, and I started to panic. After a while I heard the voice again, now behind me. I spun around quickly but saw no one. Confusion and fear overwhelmed me. I realized I had to get out of there immediately. I started running, but something strange happened. No matter how far I ran, I kept ending up in the same place, as if I were stuck in an endless loop. Just when I was about to lose hope and thought it couldn't get worse, I sensed a presence behind me. I turned around and there was a man with a knife aimed at me. My blood froze. My heart stopped for a moment. I tried to move, but my legs were paralyzed by fear. The man came closer and finally I turned to run. I only managed a few steps before slipping and falling. As I tried to stand up, the man sat on my chest. I could see something was off about him. His eyes glowed like burning coals, shifting side to side. His face was pale, and he was breathing like a wild animal. Then I saw him raise the knife to stab me. But suddenly I heard gunshots. It was the police. They shot the man in the hand, and the knife fell to the ground. One officer ran to me and overpowered the psychopath, literally saving my life. After they took him away, the police reported that this guy had escaped from a nearby psychiatric facility and had been randomly attacking people with a knife. That day he'd already injured 5 people. After taking him back to the institution, I thought everything would go back to normal. But even afterward I kept hearing that voice and those strange noises. I tried to ignore them, but I was so overwhelmed by everything that had happened that I eventually fainted. I guess it was all too much for a 10-year-old. When I woke up I saw the supervisor sitting next to me, worried. I told him I didn't want to talk because I was still in shock. But when he saw my condition he called my parents. I dozed off again. The next time I opened my eyes, my parents were there, horrified by what had happened. I begged them to take me away from that place because I was terrified. It didn't take much convincing for them to decide to bring me home. After that incident I never heard the voice again. Despite the encounter with the madman, I don't think that was what scared me most about that place. When I think of that school, I still think of that voice and that weird event in the hallway before the crazy man appeared. Why was I the only one who heard it? And why did I never hear it again after leaving that place? To this day I wonder if it was all just my imagination, triggered by the stress and loneliness I felt at that boarding school, or if something truly sinister was trying to communicate with me. My name is Edmund, and I'm a teacher. The school where I work is located in a remote area outside the city. This happened a few years ago. I was teaching the 10th grade at the time. The day was going normally until a job posting appeared, a vacancy for a chemistry teacher in our school paper. That very same day, a man arrived to apply for the job. His name was Benjamin. He showed up at the principal's office and I was also present for the interview. It was his first day at the school, and I remember that he wore formal clothing, simple glasses, and a large black bag slung over his shoulder. The principal asked him a few routine questions to check if he was truly qualified for the position. To our satisfaction, Benjamin was very intelligent and answered every question fluently. The same day he was hired and named our new chemistry teacher. The next day he officially started. Benjamin and I had chatted for a while on the day of his interview, and from then on we became good friends. He greeted me every morning when he arrived at school and we got along well. A few days after he joined the teaching staff, we were having lunch in the teacher's lounge when his phone, which lay on the table, started ringing. I noticed that the screen showed a number from a foreign country just because the phone was right next to me. Benjamin quickly covered the screen with his hand, got up and walked a few steps away before answering the call. He stood by the window and I saw his expression change. His forehead creased and he looked angry, as if something had really upset him, but I couldn't understand what he was saying because he spoke in another language. After about 5 minutes he returned and sat down again. I asked him, "Who called? You look upset." Benjamin replied, "My wife called. She lives in another country and wants to divorce me now." I told him I was sorry, and that explained the change in his expression. A few days later, Benjamin took his students to the chemistry lab for an experiment. Soon, break time arrived and all the kids were either in the cafeteria or out in the yard while we teachers gathered in the lounge. When I got there, I noticed Benjamin was missing. I assumed he was still in the lab, so I went there. As I entered, something seemed strange. There was a small storage room in the lab where chemicals and lab equipment were kept. That room was normally locked and only opened when needed. Yet just as I walked in, I saw Benjamin closing that storage room door. I didn't think much of it. He was the chemistry teacher after all and might have needed something for class. "Why aren't you coming to lunch, Ben?" I asked. "Oh, I was just leaving, but we ran out of some chemicals in the lab, so I grabbed some from the storage room," he said. Then he walked up to me, put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Come on, let's go eat," nudging me gently out of the lab. After lunch I returned to my class where I was met with a lot of commotion among the students. I told them to calm down and asked what was going on. One of the students said, "Sir, I can't find my friend Louis." That surprised me and I asked, "What do you mean? Are you sure he came to school today?" The student was sure Louis had been there before the break. I was eating and playing during recess, so I didn't pay much attention, but at some point he wasn't with me anymore, the boy said. Suddenly, noises erupted from other parts of the school. I ran out into the hallway and saw that almost all the teachers had gathered, but Benjamin wasn't among them. I asked what was going on and learned that 5 students were missing. Naturally, everyone was alarmed and there was a lot of commotion in the halls. I decided to go to the principal's office to talk to him and get more information, as the situation was extremely unusual. But just as we started talking, we heard a loud tumult coming from the school entrance. The entrance was a large door that stayed locked during school hours so the students couldn't leave. The principal and I looked at each other and decided to go out to see what was happening. What we saw shocked us. 3 men in military-style uniforms carrying long guns had entered the school. Their clothing was black and their faces were covered with masks. The moment they stepped inside, they shot the security guard at the entrance. Chaos erupted immediately. The principal ran back to his office to announce over the loudspeaker that a group of terrorists had invaded the school and that all doors should be locked at once. He instructed the teachers to secure their classrooms and take shelter with the students. Thanks to the loudspeakers throughout the school, everyone heard this announcement. I ran with the principal back to my own classroom while students and teachers frantically rushed through the halls trying to find safety in their rooms. Through the small window at the top of my door, I could see 4 students still out in the hallway knocking on classroom doors, but no one opened. Then I heard gunshots. I said to the principal, "Take care of the kids here and call the police quickly. I'm going out there to bring those students in." I opened the door and ran down the hall toward the 4 students. I waved to them to follow me back to my room, but before we could get there, I saw one of the terrorists carrying a large rifle heading our way. At that moment, I noticed that the door to the chemistry lab at the end of the hall was open. I rushed with the students there. We made it inside quickly, and I locked the door with the bolt. Then we barricaded it with chairs and tables to make it harder for the terrorists to break in. While we waited, we heard screams from other parts of the school along with gunfire. We were all completely terrified and could do nothing but try to hide. I took out my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. Maybe the terrorists had installed some kind of jammer so we couldn't alert the authorities. One of the terrorists came to our door and began banging on it, trying with all his might to break in. Luckily, due to a history of school shootings in the country, the school had reinforced steel doors with security locks, making them almost impossible to open when locked. Since I couldn't call the police, I started looking around the lab for anything we could use to defend ourselves if the door was forced open. There were many chemicals and I searched for something that might help. Eventually I found a bottle labeled "Do Not Touch, Highly Corrosive." I carefully opened it and let a drop fall onto the floor. It immediately let off a hot vapor and I knew that this chemical would be useful. However, there was only one bottle on the shelf. I decided to open the storage room to find more. What I saw next shocked me. The 5 missing students were in there, their hands and feet bound with tape and their mouths covered. I immediately called the others to help free them while I continued searching for more bottles of the chemical. Fortunately, I found about 10 vials. I gave each of my students one and kept one for myself. Meanwhile, the terrorist was still trying to break down the door. After firing several shots at the lock, he finally managed to force it open. But as soon as he burst through, we all threw our bottles of corrosive chemicals at him before he could react. He started screaming in pain as the powerful acid caused severe burns. He collapsed in agony. Eventually, he lost consciousness. When he was down, I went over to him and removed his mask. To my utter shock, it was Benjamin. For a moment I was frozen, but in that dangerous situation there was no time for hesitation. I quickly took his weapon, though I had no idea how to use it. Fortunately, some of my students were fans of war-themed video games that accurately depicted real weapons. They showed me how to operate it. We grabbed a few more bottles of the chemical and his gun and left the lab to get to my classroom, where we wanted to barricade ourselves with the other students and the principal, this time ready to defend ourselves. I knocked on the door. My students inside were screaming in fear, thinking it was the terrorists. But I called out that it was me, and soon the principal opened the door. We went in and I told the principal everything that had happened. We stayed in the classroom on high alert until a few minutes later we heard sirens in the distance. A loudspeaker outside demanded that the terrorists surrender, saying they were surrounded. A few minutes later, police officers approached the classrooms and told us through the doors that the situation was under control and we could come out. We finally left our rooms feeling safe again. That day was a terrible tragedy. 16 people, teachers and students, lost their lives and at least 20 were injured. Benjamin's 2 accomplices were killed while he was taken to the hospital with severe burns, then sent to prison where he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars, scarred by the burns he suffered. I've always loved being a teacher, especially for the little ones. In high school, I already enjoyed helping my younger brother with his homework, and it was clear to me that once I finished college, I'd become a teacher. I started as a school assistant, and quickly realized working with small children was just right for me. They're adorable, funny, and endlessly curious. If you show them love and understanding, they respond in surprising ways. Maybe by offering little gifts like apples or cookies, or simply with a warm hug. It's incredibly rewarding. Sure, there are tough times, but once you learn how to calm them and support them, even tense moments become more manageable. But a few years ago, I faced a situation I was definitely not prepared for. I thought I'd seen everything in my years as a teacher, but there's always something that catches you completely off guard. I remember it like it was yesterday, and I still have nightmares about that child. It was the start of a new school year, and I was excited to get everything ready for the arrival of my new students, especially the little ones who usually came in hand with their parents. Those parents would kiss their kids and wish them luck before dropping them off in my class. But that day, a red-haired boy came in all alone, sat in a corner, and didn't say a single word. I'd never seen him before, and assumed he was new. I went over to him, thinking he might just be shy, and introduced myself. "Hello there. I'm Mrs. Sabrina. What's your name?" "Elliot Foster," he answered in a surprisingly mature voice. "It's nice to have you in my class, Elliot," I replied. "I'm going to check the class list to make sure you're in the right place." Indeed, his name was on the list. But I still found it strange how confident he sounded, almost like an adult. Maybe he was exceptionally smart, Or his parents had taught him to act that way, I thought. I tried not to dwell on it. Over time, though, Elliot's strangeness became more apparent. He did his homework flawlessly, without a single mistake. Whenever I asked a question in class, he would answer immediately, demonstrating surprising knowledge for his age. Yet he was extremely quiet and serious. The other kids often made jokes and laughed, but Elliot stayed apart, as if he wanted nothing to do with them. I began to think he had trouble socializing, so I organized group activities to encourage him. But he always kept to his own spot, as far from everyone else as possible. Whenever another child approached him, he tensed visibly and seemed irritable. His normally cold expression turned into a look of anger, which worried me. Before I reported this to the school administration, I decided to observe him more closely. Over several weeks I noticed that the dark circles under his eyes were becoming more pronounced. I also saw that during breaks he sat alone to eat, and his lunchboxes seemed carefully prepared, except on Fridays, when he brought pizza, hamburgers, or fries. It was as if that particular day was special to him. His posture was always slumped, shoulders drooping, yet his gaze was always alert. It confused me to see a child behave so strangely, on the one hand so intelligent and responsible, but on the other so cold, lonely, and angry. Finally, I went to the principal about it. Unfortunately, he didn't show much interest, although he agreed to invite Elliot's parents in for a meeting. I hoped that talking to them would shed light on Elliot's odd behavior. When they arrived, the atmosphere became tense. Both parents seemed cold and stern, their expressions devoid of warmth. It was unsettling. As we talked, Elliot sat in a corner, staring into space like he was in another world. The conversation with his parents was brief. They responded mostly in monosyllables and seemed uninterested. After this meeting, my perception of Elliot changed. I began sensing that he wasn't just odd, but also deeply sad. I resolved to do whatever I could to help him, even though the situation was complicated. What followed was even more disturbing. His parents had agreed to meet with me again on Wednesday after school. That morning, Elliot was especially irritable. He wouldn't let anyone near him, and was on the verge of yelling at a child. So I stepped in. "Elliot, calm down. They didn't do anything. You don't have to be aggressive. Would you rather eat alone in the classroom? I'll stay with you," he answered with obvious hatred in his voice. "Why are you scolding me? I did everything right, did my homework, and it's your fault. I hate you. Leave me alone." I had never experienced such hostility from a child so young. Elliot was 8, but sometimes he seemed like a stubborn, hateful grown-up. I decided to give him some space, hoping to talk to him more calmly later. We'd arranged another talk with his parents after school. When the final bell rang, I waited for them at the school entrance. Elliot was there, looking even more serious than usual, which says a lot. He stood waiting for his parents. Soon, a tall red-haired man with deep eye bags approached, followed by a blonde woman who seemed stiff. It was clear these were Elliot's parents. I introduced myself and guided them to the office, leaving Elliot outside. While talking to them, I noticed the man was staring at me in a creepy way. "His behavior is really odd," I said. "Has he always been like this? Just leave him alone," his father replied without blinking. The tension in the room was unbearable, so I ended the meeting, seeing they had no intention of accepting help. Outside, the man yanked Elliot roughly by the arm and walked off with his wife. I felt helpless. The next day my attention went back to Elliot, who looked more exhausted than ever. But what bothered me most was the look he gave me. Suddenly, he was ice cold, brimming with intense hatred, almost threatening. It was as if he'd taken a turn for the worse, and I had no idea how to help him. That morning, I had an unshakable chill down my spine, like I was sensing something, but I couldn't say what. Toward lunchtime, my nerves were on edge. I left the kids with a worksheet, and stepped out into the hallway for a moment of fresh air. Suddenly, a piercing scream came from my classroom. "What happened?" I shouted, rushing back in. Then I saw it. A little girl was standing in front of Elliot, screaming in rage. "Go away." The girl was terrified and confused, and she didn't move. Before I could intervene, the unthinkable happened. Elliot grabbed a pair of scissors off his desk and lunged at the girl, stabbing her repeatedly in the chest. My heart froze. The classroom filled with terrified shrieks while Elliot screamed. "I told you to go away. I warned you." I rushed over and managed to pull Elliot off the girl, but she was already covered in blood. I yelled desperately, "Let go of her." Just then, I felt a sharp pain in my arm. Elliot had stabbed me too. By then other teachers had set off the alarm, and the police were called. The girl was taken to the hospital. Thankfully, her injuries weren't life-threatening, but it was close. What came to light afterward was shocking. Elliot's mother confessed that his father was a murderer, who for years had forced his wife and son to witness terrible acts of violence. Elliot had been exposed to brutality and cruelty from a young age. Although he tried to control himself, he harbored an indescribable inner pressure that finally erupted in violence. The reason he couldn't bear to be touched was that he feared losing control and hurting someone. Elliot's case became known throughout the city. The parents, who initially seemed normal, turned out to be the central figures in a horrifying story that had played out right under our noses. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened as I walked the school hallways. The memory of Elliot's cold gaze will stay with me forever. I felt helpless and sad for having missed my chance to help a lost child, and for witnessing an unimaginable drama unfold. The memory of that day will always stay with me, not only as a frightening experience, but also as a reminder to be more vigilant, to notice the signs, and never give up when it comes to helping someone. Everyone groaned when the fire alarm went off. Normally, we would have been enjoying Mr. Graham's break while he talked about lines, planes, and equations, but it was a cold, rainy April day. Our windows overlooked a field 3 floors down, where we were supposed to gather. The class stood up to line up for the drill. Amy glanced over at me and winked, shaking her head, but I could see things were good between us. If only I could borrow my dad's car for the weekend, and take her somewhere nice. Looking back, that was all I had in mind at the time. A pretty girl to date, and a way to stay awake in another hour of geometry. Today I have nightmares whenever I recall that the school closed that day, and it all started with that alarm. Before we could properly line up for the fire drill, we suddenly heard someone scream outside our classroom, and it set off a chain reaction of panic. Mr. Graham frowned, signaling us to stay where we were, and he went to the door, sticking his head into the hallway. The classroom fell silent. Occasionally someone whispered. My friend Colleen, who sat behind me, whispered, "I think there's really a fire." "I don't know," I replied. Then another scream came, closer this time, right in the hallway. Mr. Graham yanked his head back so fast he slipped, knocking over a desk. Several students helped him up, peppering him with questions about what was happening. Graham ignored them, stood up, slammed the door, and locked it. "Everyone stay calm and get under your desks," Mr. Graham said, turning off the lights. I hesitated a moment, but we could all see the fear on our teacher's face, even in the dimly lit room. The only light came from the small window at the top of the door, weakly illuminating the hallway. We all crawled under our desks, either crouching or on our knees. The screaming started again, this time multiple voices together, very close. Kelly, who was under a desk, stared at me with wide eyes. "What's going on?" she whispered. All I could do was shrug. I didn't know either. Suddenly there was a loud pounding on our door, echoing in its frame. Some classmates gasped. One even let out a nervous laugh. Mr. Graham crouched behind his big desk, staring at the door. His hands fumbled across the desktop, as if searching for something. Eventually I saw his hand close around a pair of scissors. Another round of banging on the door, and now a shadow appeared in the window. The glass was so foggy that it was impossible to make out details, but whoever stood in the hallway was massive. I heard a moan from the back of the room, but it was too dark to see who it was. Someone hissed that they should be quiet, but ironically the hissing was louder than the moan. Then we heard a new sound, the doorknob being pulled, shaken violently. Someone was trying to get into our classroom. Slowly I pulled out my phone and dialed 3 digits. But before I could connect to emergency services, the door flew open. Whoever was out there must have kicked the lock in. Mr. Graham jumped up, scissors in hand, like he was going to throw them like a spear. But the huge intruder knocked him down with a brutal strike before he got close. I watched in horror as my teacher stumbled backward into his desk and rolled across the floor. The tall man stepped inside and switched on the lights. We all screamed at once, Kelly included. I, however, couldn't make a sound. My throat felt squeezed shut. He was at least 6.5 feet tall, covered in tattoos that snaked up his neck and merged with deep scars on his face, giving him a terrifying appearance. He had no hair, not even eyebrows, and a dull expression that was somehow even more intimidating. Another man entered behind him, also in prison attire, but smaller, almost fox-like in the way his eyes darted around the room. "Let's take a few of them with us, and barricade ourselves in the gym," suggested the smaller prisoner to the larger one. The tall man shook his head. "Cops never go upstairs. They already got Bradley," he said. The smaller man grunted, shutting the door, which didn't close well. "Did you break the lock?" he asked. "Obviously," replied the tall man. Then the tall man shoved Mr. Graham's desk against the door, adding a shelf and some chairs for a makeshift barricade. While he did that, the smaller man snapped his fingers to get our attention. "Okay kids, if you all listen and cooperate, you'll get back to mommy and daddy safely." Colleen, who'd crawled over to me, trembled so much that I could feel it. She gripped my hand, and I squeezed back. The tall man moved to the center of the classroom. Up close, he looked even more menacing. A jagged scar ran over his right eye like a trench, and I could see that iris and pupil were cloudy and blind. He was covered in muscles, his arms and shoulders straining against his prison overalls, which were burned and knotted in places. He opened his mouth to say something, but just then, wisps of smoke drifted under the door. The smaller inmate cursed and rummaged through Mr. Graham's desk for something, maybe a weapon. He looked like a trapped animal. The tall man, however, remained calm, watching the smoke seep through the cracks of his barricade. When the smoke reached me and Colleen, we started coughing. Later we learned it was tear gas, and the police were standing just outside. All I knew then was that breathing felt difficult, and my eyes watered. Colleen wrapped her arms around me, and I held her. I lost sight of the smaller prisoner, but not the tall man. He never coughed once. Instead, he strode calmly to the windows by my desk, the same window I had looked out of just 10 minutes earlier. When the fire alarm started, he stood by that window for a moment, then turned to look at us one last time. In that moment our eyes locked. The expression in his was so cold that it still haunts my dreams. I didn't think he wanted to hurt us. The truth is, he could have taken us hostage, like the other suggested, or even fought. But instead he opened the window. I was shocked he could fit through it, given how big he was. He slowly lifted one leg over the sill, then the other, maybe thinking he could survive the jump from 3 floors up. He didn't say a word, he just jumped. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. A second later, the police stormed the room, broke down the barricade, and tear gas filled the space. The smaller prisoner screamed that he was surrendering. Amid all that, I walked to the window. I shouldn't have looked, but I couldn't help it. 1 second later, I wished I hadn't. The tall man lay on the stone walkway around the school building. His arms, legs, and neck were twisted at horrifying angles, and a thin pool of blood seeped into the grass. Later I learned that morning 3 men had escaped from the local prison, killing 2 guards in the process. All were serving lengthy sentences, but the tall man had chosen to end his sentence prematurely. "Jen," I called excitedly when I spotted my best friend from school, as I reconnected with my group of school friends for this long-awaited reunion after 5 years. Jenna, Haley and I hugged in a painfully tight group hug, all squealing with excitement at finally seeing each other again. We were waiting for Sophie, who was also part of our group. "Girls," she shouted, as she finally approached, and we all headed to the hotel. We felt great and accepted the admiring looks. We all still looked gorgeous. Jenna was a designer, while Haley and Sophie were social media influencers, doing great in their careers. We really couldn't complain. Over dinner, we reminisced about old school days, my heart filling with nostalgia. "Remember the girls with braces?" Haley asked while casually flirting with the waiter, who blushed and quickly left. I burst out laughing. We were often labeled bullies, but look at us now, successful women, and it feels amazing. After a lovely dinner, we said goodbye and got into our cars. I remember getting home, showering, and falling straight to sleep. But later that night, my phone rang. It was Haley, and she sounded terrified. "What do you mean Sophie is hurt?" I asked, panic welling up in me. Haley explained Sophie was in the hospital, and gave me the address. With my stomach in knots, I sped there, imagining all sorts of horrible scenarios. When I arrived, my heart nearly stopped upon seeing Sophie's face. It was swollen blue, and her 2 front teeth were missing. She wept silently, which broke my heart. Haley's expression was filled with worry. I tried to comfort her, but Sophie's sobs wouldn't stop. "What happened?" I asked. Sophie explained that she'd left her house to buy something at the supermarket, and when she entered her building, a masked man attacked her. He covered her mouth so she couldn't scream, and in a gruesome turn of events, used pliers to pull out her teeth while she was unconscious. I couldn't believe it. I felt helpless, flooded by anger and sadness. Who could do such a thing? That night, I stayed with Sophie in the hospital, and promised to come back the next day, as did Haley. The following morning, I arrived a bit late and noticed Haley wasn't there. I asked Sophie if Haley had come, and Sophie shook her head. I felt unease creeping in. I tried calling Haley, and after a few rings someone picked up, saying Haley had been in an accident, and was waiting for an ambulance. My hands began to tremble, and my mind went blank as Sophie frantically asked what was wrong. I could only say I'd be right back. Without much thought, I left, leaving Sophie behind, and drove straight to Haley's house. An ambulance was already there, so I followed it to the hospital. As soon as we arrived and I saw Haley, I froze. Her lips were swollen, and she'd clearly lost her 2 front teeth as well. No, I whispered, everything going dark in my head. I turned around, hands shaking, and went home in a daze. What was happening to my friends? A shadow of fear loomed over me, leaving an icy knot in my stomach. I was convinced Jenna and I would be next. First Sophie, then Haley. This couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was stalking us. I parked my car and got out. Suddenly the bushes next to me rustled. I froze, took a deep breath, and tried to ignore the paranoia creeping up. I reached my door, pulled out my keys, heart pounding. I opened the door, and just as I was about to close it, a masked man burst in, snatching the keys from my hand. I stumbled back, dizzy with terror. This is real, I thought as the dark figure slammed the door shut. I started to shake, knowing I was next, but I tried to appear brave. While he moved slowly toward me, I spun left and ran for the door, but he grabbed me by the waist and pulled me back. I started screaming, pressing my hand against his face in desperation. In our struggle, his mask slipped, and I had just enough time to see who it was. The shock in his eyes as they locked with mine gave me the chance to break free and run. I dashed for my car and drove straight to the nearest police station, telling them everything I knew. They issued a warrant to catch the attacker. Even then, I was still struggling to process what had happened. I recognized that man, Jacob. He had gone to the same school as me. There was no mistaking it. We'd often made fun of him for losing his 2 front teeth. Now he was out for revenge, and apparently I was his next victim. He had one more target he'd forgotten though. Jenna. I immediately called her and explained who was attacking us. Luckily she was on a flight back to her hometown, which calmed me a little. But at the same time I knew I was in real danger. Surely I was next on his list. I couldn't sleep at home that night, so I stayed, terrified, in a hotel. The next night, however, I decided Jacob wouldn't be stupid enough to show up again while the police were after him. With that in mind, I went back home. The calm I felt upon entering vanished quickly when I locked the door and set my keys on the table. A chill ran through me. "Alice," I heard someone say. I froze, a glass of water halfway to my lips, and turned around very slowly. Jacob was there, flashing an evil grin. My legs turned to jelly, and I crumpled to the floor, dropping the glass, which shattered. "Please," I managed weakly, trying to crawl away. Jacob laughed, the sound echoing in the room as he pulled out a pair of pliers. My face went white with dread. I couldn't let him pull out my teeth. Without thinking, I sprang up and ran as fast as I could. He followed close behind. I rushed into my bedroom, convinced I knew every inch of my house. I scrambled under the bed, hand pressed over my mouth to stifle my breathing. I watched in silence as his boots stopped in the doorway. He muttered curses, obviously confused about where I'd gone. He stepped inside, and I tensed. Tears streaked my face. Just when I thought it was the end, we both heard sirens in the distance. Jacob cursed and bolted from my room. I stayed under the bed, feeling like hours passed before I dared to move. Finally, I peeked out and saw the police had arrived. Jacob lay handcuffed on the floor. I felt the deepest relief of my life. Fortunately, my friends recovered from their injuries, despite needing replacements for their front teeth. They still look fantastic though. As for Jacob, he got 5 years in prison, and a lifelong restraining order from each of us. Still, despite everything that happened, we can't simply call ourselves victims. Yes, Jacob acted in an evil way, but we had sown the seeds of this feud through our behavior toward him in school. Nothing justifies his brutality, but we also know that bullying can have serious consequences. It happened in 2004. My brother and I lived with our mom, who was a lawyer and a single mother. I was in my first year of high school, and my brother was about to graduate. Our life was fairly normal. Mom earned good money, and our home was always happy. But everything changed when one of her cases got her into trouble. Mom had defended a woman who had been attacked, and the attacker was sentenced to 20 years in prison. What we didn't know was that this man had a son who went to our school. That son, Jake, had promised my mother he would make her life hell because of what she'd done. Neither my brother nor I knew any of this, as Mom never talked about her work with us, and threats are commonplace in a lawyer's job, so she likely didn't take it seriously. It was the day our nightmare began. The day started normally. I was a shy, observant girl who preferred going to the bathroom when it was empty, because I felt uncomfortable around other girls. That morning it turned out to be a big mistake. Our school walls were made of glass, so everyone could see me in the hallway, and I could see them. While I was heading to the restroom with my phone in my hand, I noticed Jake nearby, but I paid him no attention. At that time I knew he was the son of the man Mom had sent to prison, but he had never done anything to my brother or me, so I didn't think much of it. While I was in there, the door opened, and I ignored it, assuming another girl came in to check the mirror or something. But something felt off, like a bad vibe in the air. Suddenly I was filled with dread, as if my instincts were warning me of danger. I stood still, and then I heard a sarcastic laugh, followed by someone whispering my last name. When I realized it was a boy's voice, I knew it had to be Jake. He repeated my last name, and I felt more and more threatened. Suddenly he started knocking on the stall doors, one by one moving closer to mine. Panic overwhelmed me, my mind filled with horrible images of what he might do to me. I was terrified, but I decided I had to run. I flung my stall door open and sprinted toward the exit, but I wasn't quick enough. Before I reached the door, Jake grabbed me and slammed me down, causing my head to hit the floor very hard. I looked up and saw him standing over me, one foot on my body to keep me down. Wearing a creepy grin, he said, "Hello, Cassie." I was petrified and had no clue what to do. I tried to scream, but then he pressed his foot on my throat, starting to choke me. "What do you want?" I gasped, tears filling my eyes. He didn't answer. He just leaned forward threateningly and pulled out a small knife to show me, all the while stretching his smile. The next moments are a blur. I recall him telling me not to scream and forcing me against the wall. High on adrenaline, I fought back, kicking and yelling, even though I was just a small girl barely 5 feet tall, and he was a football player. I don't know how, but somehow I kept the knife from cutting me for a while. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a group of girls came in, laughing, unaware of the chaos they just walked into. Their sudden arrival distracted Jake right at the moment he had cornered me, ready to stab me. I seized the distraction. In one final, desperate move, I bit his hand with all my strength, forcing him to release me, and I fled. I ran out of the restroom, shouting for help. My first instinct was to find my older brother in his English class. But as I ran through the hallway, my adrenaline began to fade, and I realized with horror that I felt a stabbing pain in my shoulder and lower abdomen. Looking down, I saw I was bleeding. The terrifying truth dawned on me. In the struggle, Jake had stabbed me without my noticing. I kept running. Students and teachers peered at me through the glass walls, alarmed by my bloody appearance. The 2 girls who'd seen our fight were screaming, drawing a larger crowd. I was overwhelmed and dizzy. The blood loss was hitting me, and everyone was in panic, teachers trying to calm the chaos, but failing. Then in the midst of the confusion, I spotted my brother. It felt like reaching a safe haven in a storm. If I hadn't found him, I don't know what would have happened. I ran straight to him. He grabbed my shoulders, trying to make me look up. Everything blurred, and I collapsed in his arms. I have no memory of what happened after that. But my friends and brother told me later, once I'd recovered from my injuries. My brother screamed for help. "My sister is bleeding." That made everyone pay attention. Some teachers ran to me while other students called 911. My brother, always strong, started demanding who had done this. The girls thought Jake was still in the restroom, so he and some other students ran there. I wish he hadn't, because that triggered more panic. Jake hadn't tried to escape. He was just standing there, knife still in hand, leaning against the wall. As soon as my brother appeared, he lunged at him, determined to beat him down. Fortunately, some of my classmates held him back, giving the teachers time to get me to the hospital. The police eventually arrested Jake. Apparently he had caused damage near my bladder, so I needed emergency surgery with only a 40% chance of survival. To manage my pain, they put me in a medically induced coma so I wouldn't move and damage any tubes or monitors. Of course I survived my injuries, but I spent a month in that coma. When I woke up, recovery was rough, not just because of the coma, but also because of the trauma of nearly being stabbed to death. The school tried to hush it up so nobody would talk, but rumors spread anyway. I decided to use the rest of the year to heal before returning. When I finally did, nothing was the same. My brother became extremely overprotective, and my mom quit her job. We've never heard from Jake since. I still have nightmares about him, and constant anxiety. As an adult, things have calmed down for my family. And even though Jake nearly killed me and put me in a coma, I honestly don't hold a grudge. I just hope he learned something from it. He needed help, and never got it. As for me, I've moved on. I only hope I never see him again. Hello, my name is Emma. Early in September, I started my final year of high school. I was more of a loner, and usually kept to myself. I lived in a very rural part of northern Washington state, so I had to drive quite a distance to get to school on time. I remember a student named Rake, whom I didn't know well, but he never seemed to bother anyone, until out of nowhere he started acting strangely toward me. One day we were in history class, and while I was taking notes, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned and saw Rake looking at me from his seat in the right corner of the front row. He said a few words to me, but I couldn't understand what he was trying to say. I ignored it and continued. Later that day, I saw him multiple times in the corridors. He threw menacing looks at me and made weird gestures. I didn't want any drama, so I ignored him as much as possible and went about my routine. At the end of the day, in my last class, I was just getting ready to leave when I froze. At the end of the hallway stood Rake again, staring at me. I pretended I hadn't seen him and tried to disappear in the crowd of students leaving. But as I got in my car, I noticed him standing in the parking lot, watching me drive away. It made me uneasy, but I pushed it aside. On the drive home, my aunt called and asked if I could swing by her place for a few things. I spent a while chatting with her, which distracted me enough to forget about Rake for a bit. That night though, I received a text from an unknown number. "I know where you live." I didn't know what to think, so I ignored it, figuring it was spam or someone who had the wrong number. I went back to my homework. A while later, I got another message, more alarming this time. A photo of me entering the school building. Then another photo of me walking through the school hallway. Both were taken from behind. Then came a third message that made my blood run cold. It was my home address. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding. My parents weren't home that night, so I was alone, terrified. I quickly locked all the doors, closed all the curtains, and shut every window. At the last window in the living room, I paused and looked out. I saw a silhouette in the front yard. It was too dark to tell who it was, but I quickly closed the curtains and went down to the basement. I hid in the basement, waiting in eerie silence, expecting something awful any moment. Suddenly I heard someone trying the door handle. Thank God it was locked, but just knowing someone was trying to get in was terrifying. 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps above me. My heart nearly stopped. Whoever was outside had found a way in. I crept under an old desk, thinking I should have called the police when I had the chance, but not wanting to give away my hiding spot. My worst fear was confirmed when the basement door slowly creaked open. I saw the light from the corridor before it went dark again. Then everything was silent. After a moment, I heard a voice. "Hello, Rake here. I know you're down here. I can see you. Come on out." I didn't move, unsure if he was lying. Then I heard him walk down the stairs, knocking things over. He was getting closer and closer, until he was standing right in front of the desk. My heart pounded like crazy. Silence. Then Rake said, "Okay, I gave you the chance to make this easy. Now you've really made me mad." At that moment, my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could see he was holding a hammer in his right hand. Without thinking, I lunged out from under the desk, shoved him back so he fell, and ran for the stairs. As I took off, I heard him scream, "I'm gonna kill you," and something heavy clanged against the wall, probably the hammer. Once upstairs, I slammed the basement door and locked it, then ran outside screaming for help. I could hear him shouting from inside, "Hey, open this door." I finally called the police, then my parents. Within 10 minutes, I heard sirens in the distance. When the police arrived, I told them Rake was locked in the basement, but when they searched the house and opened the basement door, he was gone. He'd escaped through a window. I'd forgotten to lock the side door, which is how he got in. That didn't stop him from getting caught though. I knew who he was, so I gave the officers his details and showed them the messages he'd sent me. 2 days later, I was summoned to the principal's office. They told me Rake had been arrested and would never return to the school. Thank goodness I never saw him again. As for his motives, I still have no idea. According to my psychologist, it was probably some kind of psychotic break triggered by an obsession with me. It's crazy to think that one day someone can seem so quiet and reserved, and the next day he's in your basement, intending to kill you with a hammer. I live in a very rural part of Ontario, Canada. It was early September, and I was preparing for my first day of school. Unfortunately, I had to repeat my senior year. Because it was a small farming community, the middle school and high school shared the same building. During the first period, I had a free period. When I entered the room, I noticed a new student on the other side. He stood out, as I mentioned, because it was such a small place. So I walked over, introduced myself, and we shook hands. He told me his name was Chester, apparently new to the area. Since I'm a friendly and helpful Canadian, I showed him around the school and the room he was supposed to go to next. As I walked him through the hallways, I noticed he seemed out of place. He started asking me initially harmless questions, like how long I'd been here, or where a certain classroom was. Then he began asking weird things that made me suspicious. He wanted my address, my phone number, and even my Snapchat handle. It was as awkward as it sounds. I was so thrown off that I refused to give him my address or number, but I figured no harm would come from giving him my Snapchat. That was a decision I'd come to regret. During the last period of the day, I had English. Only 9 students were in that class. When I walked in, I took my usual seat in the second row, then turned around and noticed Chester behind me. He didn't see me at first, because he was distracted by a sandwich, more like ripping it apart or devouring it. I was stunned. It was the strangest, most disgusting thing I'd ever seen. Chester finally looked up, caught sight of me, and gave me an expression you'd see if you were on trial for murder, and the defendant turned to stare at you. That's how uncomfortable I felt. He motioned for me to come closer, but class was about to start, so I ignored him. 5 minutes later, I glanced up from my book and noticed Chester was staring at me with a predatory look, as if I were the next sandwich to devour. He beckoned me again, but I kept ignoring him. I can spot a creepy person, and he definitely looked like some exotic variant of that. I went back to reading. Then my phone buzzed. It was a Snapchat message from Chester. Come follow me. Follow him where and why? We were in the middle of class. I didn't respond. At that moment, Chester stood up and asked the teacher if he could use the restroom. He was allowed, and he left. After about 5 minutes, I also asked to go to the restroom. When I got out to the hallway, I saw Chester about 50 feet away, walking in the direction of the basement storage rooms. I hung back so he wouldn't see me. He opened a door and shut it behind him. Confused, I walked over and realized it was the door to the school basement. Nope, no way I'm going in there, I thought. I turned around and went back to class, ignoring his invitation. When I returned to my seat, another Snapchat notification popped up on my phone. Why didn't you come down to the basement? Now I was seriously creeped out. I told him to stop bothering me, that he was scaring me. Then I blocked him. After school, I went home, did my homework, and tried to calm down. Later that night, around 11 p.m. when I finished, my parents were away celebrating their anniversary, so I was alone. My phone went off again. A new friend request on Snapchat, from an account named Why Didn't You Come to the Basement? Obviously it was Chester. I blocked that account too. 30 seconds later, another request. Why did you block me? I blocked that one. Another request came in with a more chilling name. Open the door. Attached was a short video of my front porch. I froze. Chester had found my address. I ran into the living room, crept to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. He was standing on my porch, motionless, under the porch light. Our eyes met, and I dashed back to my room, phone in hand, and called 911. While I waited, I heard a dull thump at the front door. Finally, a police car pulled up, and they caught him trying to flee. He was arrested on the spot. I never saw him again. The next day, I reported Chester to the principal's office. Here's where it gets even creepier. The principal informed me there was no new student named Chester. Somehow, he'd inserted himself into the school, mingling among the students as if he belonged. And no staff member bothered to check whether he was actually enrolled. Thankfully, I never saw him again. He must have moved on once he got out of jail, and hopefully he stays gone forever. This happened when I was in high school. It was only a few weeks into the new school year, and I was new at that school. But I'd already made a few friends and wanted to make more. I was very sociable, hoping to expand my circle. Being new, I didn't yet know my way around. So one day I got lost, looking for the room where I had algebra. That's where I met the boy who would later become my stalker. He showed me around and helped me find my classroom. On the way we chatted, and at first I thought it was nice to have a friend. A week went by and I'd made more friends. I spent a lot of time with them, but felt a bit guilty that my other new friend seemed lonely, so I invited him to hang out with us. At first he hardly spoke, but eventually he opened up, mainly just to me. Over the next few days he started asking me for life advice and stuff, and I was happy to help. Then he began asking me to pat his head like a dog and put a collar on him. That was weird, but I took it as a joke and went along with it, which was my big mistake. After that he started calling me mistress. I told him to stop, that it made me uncomfortable, but apparently it was already too late. He began skipping his own classes to come to mine, standing by me constantly. He followed me everywhere, all day, even wanting to come with me to the bathroom. I asked him repeatedly to stop, but he refused, so I turned to the school for help. They said I needed proof of harassment, photos, videos, or messages. I was so frustrated because even though many teachers saw him getting kicked out of my classrooms, nothing changed. Then his behavior worsened. He became more aggressive. One day I asked a friend for help with homework. My stalker overheard, got upset, and started bullying my friend, even shoving him into lockers. From then on, he harassed any boy I talked to. Some girls might have found that flattering, but I found it annoying, immature, and borderline abusive. I told him he couldn't act that way because we were just friends. His exact words were, "They don't deserve you. They're worthless compared to my mistress." I yelled at him to leave me alone. I felt bad for being harsh, but I'd had enough of his pursuit. If he wanted to act like a dog, I was going to treat him like one. I thought I was finally free because he actually stopped following me after that. But one day I found a letter in my locker. It was from him expressing his hatred for all men and for himself, saying he must be evil because his mistress had treated him so cruelly, and that she should punish him like you'd punish a pet for misbehaving. The letter was several pages long and deeply disturbing. One of the scariest things I've ever read in my life. Worst of all was that after reading it, I looked up and saw him at the other end of the hall, watching me without blinking. Then he started walking toward me, phone in hand, showing me pictures of an anime character who looked exactly like me. Same brown eyes, same curly hair. Next he tried to give me a dog collar and asked me to go away with him. I bolted, running as far as I could until I reached the principal's office, clutching the letter. The principal read it and finally had the proof he needed. This time he contacted the police, and soon a restraining order was issued. My stalker had to appear in court, and was forbidden from coming within 50 feet of me. I thought that would be the end, that the nightmare was over. But I was wrong. About a month later, late in the evening, I was in my room doing homework when I heard a scratching at the window. I looked outside and froze in terror. My stalker was standing right there, wearing a dog collar with a leash dangling from it. He stared at me through the glass, then gave me a disgusting grin before licking the window and running off. I ran to my parents, who called the police. When they arrived, I told them who he was and what he'd done. They collected evidence from my window and arrested him for violating the restraining order. Luckily, a month later, I moved to a different city and never heard from him again. I still have nightmares though. Being stalked wasn't romantic or fun. It was terrifying, shocking and stressful. The worst experience of my life. I really hope he got the serious help he needed.